Hello and welcome to this lecture on the Transcontinental Railroad. I'd like to start out by saying that this lecture is usually about an hour and a half in my in-person class, and I've condensed it down to what I think is kind of the highlights of it, as well as trying to give you the specific detail that has been requested when learning U.S. history. It is vitally important, and this is a very significant event in United States history. So I'm going to keep everything in one video. It's going to be a little bit longer, and I apologize for that. But within this video, you're going to have different subsections. So the first, I'm going to give you a brief history on the background of the railway system. It's going to be very, very brief in the United States. And then we're going to talk about why a transcontinental railway is important, as well as we're going to be looking at the two companies that form the Transcontinental Railway, which is the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. And then finally, we're going to look at the completion of the Transcontinental Railway, which happens on May 10th, 1869. It's a very important date. And finally, we're going to be looking at the issues and kind of the significance of it. Like, what were the problems of this railway system? And why is it so important? Why is it so important that I spend an hour and a half lecture on this usually? So let us begin. First, the Transcontinental Railway, when it is complete, connects the east to the west in a geographical United States for the first time ever. And this is something that's from the inception of the United States that people wanted to connect from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. They didn't know how they were going to do it. There was a lot about, let's do the Northwest Passage, let's figure it out. And that's why we have Lewis and Clark that goes on the core of discovery. And this continually forms as more and more territory is brought into the United States. It's how do we connect it? How do we make the United States into one being? And the Transcontinental Railway System does this. On top of it, it is vitally important because as it's being built, you have communication lines that are going with it, but also you have the development of towns, you have more and more farm settlement, you have increased immigration that happens. After it's built, over hundreds of thousands of cattle are transported on it. Produce is brought from one end of the country to the other, as well as different goods. And the rapid development of the West is just exponential. Before, it was very rapid from the 1850s onward, whereas really when you get westward settlement. But it becomes so rapid that up until like modern days, you had not seen this much technological or settlement. It happens, and this increases all the way until 1900 when the West is officially closed. There's 1,775 miles of track, which is really impressive, and this is the first kind of great American accomplishment that happens. The Erie Canal to a certain extent, but this is really, as I said, transcontinental. So it goes over some of the highest mountains. It has, the engineers had to grapple with problems with. You also have deserts without water. You have the great grass plains that you have to contend with buffaloes as well as native populations. And you have to deal with a lot of issues and gaps of technology and how many laborers you're going to have. So this is kind of one of the greatest American accomplishments that happened. It's all often overlooked or just kind of, and it happened. But this is really vital and significant what we're going to talk about. Not only that not one company or a conglomerate of companies do that, but you actually have to have increased federal dollars that do this. And this is one of the largest projects that were ever financed. So that is kind of the introduction into the Transcontinental Railway System. The next is a brief background on railway systems in America. In the 1820s and 30s in England, the steam train becomes developed. And this is at a good time for the United States because we're at that time in the 1820s, 30s, actually 30s and 40s, is when you get the first industrial revolution within the United States. There's 4 industrial revolutions, the first one being in the 1830s and 40s, and then the second one is in the 1860s to 1880. It's really about the 1870s to 1890s. And then you have post-World War II, the modern industrialization, which is in the late 40s into the throughout the 50s. And then you have what is known as the modern industrialization, which is really actually more of the technological industrialization. Technological revolution. And this happens from the 1880s to the present day. And we're smack dab in the middle of the technological revolution. And this all can be encompassed in, there's different phases within history. So back into the first industrial revolution in the 1830s and 40s, and this mainly deals with textiles, as well as you have greater transportation and technology, and this happens to do with steam engines and steamboats. And with this, you get the Erie Canal, and for the first time, journeys that would take a month to do would take 10, 12 hours. And so you could actually transport your fresh produce from one side of the United States to the north, and this is very important within the Northeast. And they have rapid expansion in the Northeast, and really gives the urban development that happens in the industrialization of the North. The South, to a certain extent, also does this, but it's more based on an agrarian culture. And so much so, if you look at the amount of track that was laid prior to the Civil War, and the Civil War kind of changes everything. So prior to the Civil War, the North had about 20,000 miles of track, whereas in the South had about 9 miles, and the border states had about 1,700 miles of track. Now, that's really not a lot. And on top of this is you have different discrepancies within this track. It's not all on the same gauge. And the gauge is determined by the rail size and the train wheel size. Now, prior to the Civil War and into the Civil War era, not everything ran on the same gauge. So often you would have to go to different companies and do different tracks, and it was kind of a big mess. During the Civil War, it was kind of the understanding of how important trains were, because trains not only transported goods, they transported troops, they transported the mail system, and they were really important, and they kind of had the advantages and disadvantages for the North and the South. Within the Union, you were able to have better food production, you had increased food production, and able to get that food production to the troops that needed it, as well as had better mail system, had better communication. However, when they started invading the South, that all went away, because the South did not have as good as railway systems. So the North couldn't bring the troops in as much as possible. Now, the South also had a more discrepancy within gauge. And then also, one of the big problems towards the end of the war is with William Tecumseh Sherman's marches to Georgia and the Carolinas. It's really important. The Carolinas are far more detrimental. He ends up doing something to the South called the Sherman necktie. And what he does is he takes railway lines, his soldiers did. They would heat them up to really hot, wrap them around trees and other places, and bend them. So it kind of formed a bolo tie. If you've ever seen a bolo tie, it's just a little rounded loop. And so that's what ended up happening and destroyed the railway systems. And last week we talked about Reconstruction, and one of the things that kept cropping up, if you look at the different Reconstruction bills, is that they wanted better transportation and increase railway production within the South as well as in the North. After the Civil War, there's an increased increased emphasis in the need for railways. Okay, that's kind of a brief overview. But it's important to note that in the 1850s, prior to the war, that there was talk about having a transcontinental railway system. And the reason why is because they wanted to have access to California and Oregon and have a better line of access. And we're going to talk about that line of access in just a second. And also wanted to bring more immigration into the Mississippi River valleys as well as the Great Plains. However, it could not agree on where to start the Transcontinental Railways. Should it be just in the north, should it be in the south? And it kind of forestalled. And the big question is why, how did they transport goods prior, from the east to the west, prior to the Transcontinental Railway? Well, there's 3 different ways they did it. The first way is they would sail around Cape Horn, which is the southernmost headlands of the Tierra del Fuego. I'm terrible at Spanish, I apologize. The archipelago in the southernmost part of Chile. and is located on the small Hornos Islands. So they would go all the way around it. Now it is extremely. There's a reason that it is called called with so much fire, and there's so much storms that go on. Ships were lost. You couldn't go during certain times of the year, and it would take months to get around it. The second and not even less dangerous route, it was you would sail to Panama and transverse across the Panama Isthmus, which is the Isthmus of Darien. And this is prior to the Panama Canal, obviously. So what you do is you take a ship to the Isthmus of Darien. You would have to physically transport the goods across the isthmus, take another ship, and go around to get to San Francisco, or vice versa. And so this was usually pretty detrimental. There were a lot of thieves. There were a lot of pirates that came around there and stole goods. Also, with weather, like during hurricane season and stuff, you cannot transport, or you couldn't at that time. Now, the third way is to take a wagon train and go all the way across. Now, a lot of people did this. However, a lot of people lost a lot of goods. And doing wagon trains or having trappers bring things back and forth was very dangerous. There was a lot of natural disasters that happened. There was a lot of places where you could starve. There was, if your wagon wheel lost a wheel, you had fighting that would occur. You would have thieves. It was very difficult, and you couldn't bring perishable foods from one side to another. They would go bad, and so you get really in the 1830s and 40s, you get kind of more of preserving. You still have a lot of preserved goods that are going on. So all of these methods cost a fortune to go through, and often they would spoil. They wouldn't reach the destination. Your ship would go down. Your wagon would be lost fording a river, and so it was very expensive. But what was kind of the drive behind getting this railway system in the 1850s is because in 1848 gold is discovered in California. And subsequently in the late 1840s and 1850s, everyone was trying to get to California. But also not only to California, but also there's subsequent gold and silver rushes in Nevada, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, and the Dakotas. So it was like, let's get these goods and let's get more people over there as well. So with the Transcontinental Railway, kind of how it comes into fruition is that we have this need. It's very expensive to get over there. So let's do this. So it requires almost over 2,000 miles of track, or almost 2,000 miles, and a land that had not been settled, and it required more capital than had ever been put into one single investment. As I had just stated, the sectional differences were very acute, but eventually what it decided is, post-Civil War, that they totally threw out the southern route. And so they decided that the northern route was going to be the one to do it. And Congress passed legislation for the northern route. And that would start in Omaha, Nebraska, where they already had a railway to. And on the same time, they agreed that the railway venture in California would start in Sacramento. And so they would build simultaneously through two separate companies, which were formed, and people put bids in. And the two companies that ended up becoming is the Union Pacific, which would build west through the Great Plains, and the Central Pacific, which would start in Sacramento and go east to connect with the Union Pacific. Now, for each mile of track that was going to be connected, the federal government would pay a bonus between 16 and 48,000, depending on the railway terrain. So, in the charter of 1862, the two companies which were formed, they would get 16,000 for per mile of level track, 32,000 for plateau track, 48,000 for mountain track, as well as on top of all this, they would get the public domain land rights on the side of the track. So they would the government would give them so much land on each side of the track. And they could sell that to potential investors and to settlers and to people to get the money. And with this, ended up lobbyists helped to increase the amount of money to build the track. And a great example of this, of kind of the corruption that goes behind this, is that Josiah Whitney, who was an engineering professor, and he ended up telling the federal government that, in fact, the gently sloping hills outside of the Sacramento Valley were, in fact, mountain terrain. So, in response to doing so, Leland Stanford ends up naming the mountain Mount Whitney for him. So that is the origin of how Mount Whitney got its name.